Thank you so much for being here. I'm delighted to be here. It's the first time I've been in Florida. It's the first time in Key West. It's really fun to be here. I'm especially happy. So my name is Emily Wilson, and I did a new translation of the Odyssey, and that's the main thing I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to try not to talk for the whole time because I'd love to hear from all of you, and I hope we can have some Q&A time at the end. I'm especially happy to be here this year with the theme of adaptations. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've spent my career being obsessed with adaptation. I wrote a book about tragedy, going back to the Athenian tragedies and then on to early modern tragedy, Shakespeare and Milton, about how later writers adapt the tropes, the genre, for their own purposes, and also about how characters within tragedy adapt or fail to adapt to total disaster. I also wrote a book about the death of Socrates as both a real and imaginary event, and how that character, that event, got adapted in later cultural eras to mean different things to different kinds of people. I also wrote a book about Seneca, the Roman writer, philosopher, dramatist, which is about how this ultra-rich, ultra-elite writer tried to adapt his strict anti-consumerist ethical philosophy to fit his privileged lifestyle, or the other way around. So it's a different kind of adaptation. I've also done a lot of verse translations from ancient Greek and Latin, including translations of Seneca's tragedies, translations of Euripides, Sophocles, and the Odyssey, which is what I'm mostly going to focus on. I'm interested in translation in both practical and theoretical ways, in how translation itself is a kind of adaptation. It's a kind which owes a particularly heavy debt to an original, but I think it isn't actually totally different in kind from all the other kinds of adaptation that we'll be hearing about over the next couple of days. So I wanted to start just by reading a passage from my translation, and I'll start with what in a way is the beginning of the story of Odysseus' journey home, though it doesn't happen in the poem until Book 5, because the Odyssey has such an interestingly inset narrative kind of narrative technique. This is when the god Hermes is traveling across the water to the goddess Calypso's island, which is very far away, to tell Calypso that she has to finally let Odysseus go after the lovely 7 years that they've spent together. This is telling about Hermes. At once he fastened on his feet the sandals of everlasting gold, with which he flies on breath of air across the sea and land. He seized the wand with which he magics eyes to sleep or wake as he desires. He held it and flew. The god flashed bright in all his power. He touched Pieria. Then from the sky he plunged into the sea and swooped between the waves, just like a seagull catching fish, wetting its whirring wings in tireless brine. So Hermes scudded through the surging swell. Then finally he reached the distant island, stepped from the indigo water to the shore, and reached the cavern where the goddess lived. There sat Calypso with her braided curls. Beside the hearth a mighty fire was burning. The scent of citrus and of brittle pine suffused the island. Inside, she was singing and weaving with a shuttle made of gold. Her voice was beautiful. Around the cave, a luscious forest flourished, alder, poplar, and scented cypress. It was full of wings. Birds nested there, but hunted out at sea, the owls, the hawks, the gulls with gaping beaks. A ripe and fertile vine hung thick with grapes was stretched to coil around her cave. 4 springs spurted with sparkling water as they laced with crisscrossed currents intertwined together. The meadow softly bloomed with celery and violets. He gazed around in wonder and joy at sights to please even a god. Even the deathless god who once killed Argos stood still, his heart amazed at all he saw. So I wanted to start by reading so that you just have a sense of what my translation sounds like. I hope that you could pick up that it's in regular iambic pentameter, And I also, that I was working to bring out the different perspectives, different feeling of each location in the poem. That, of course, in that passage, we have a very different location when Hermes is traveling across the sea from the feeling of being in Calypso's crisscross island. The Odyssey is astonishingly precise in how it describes even the most bizarre events or places, even if you're not usually a believer in Olympian gods. I think the listener of this passage ought for a moment to totally believe that the god in his gold-winged sandals can swoop through the waves and get this wonderfully precise image of this place that's unlike any other, though maybe it's actually a bit like Key West, the impossibly jungly island of Calypso, the artful goddess whose name means hiding, where even the water is crisscrossed and mixed, covering itself with itself. It's artful and direct, fast, musical, psychologically acute, emotionally engaging, and both very strange and otherworldly, and also ordinary. Like we get told, how do you put on your sandals, all at the same time. When Pete Simon, my editor at Norton, approached me to consider doing an Odyssey translation, I was super excited to be asked, because I've always loved this poem. Ever since I was 8 years old and I got to play the goddess Athena wearing a tinfoil helmet that I made myself in the elementary school play. So obviously my relationship with the poem has changed over the years. I've been reading it in Greek for the last 3 decades. But it remains to me a beautiful, infinitely rich narrative about questions I think about all the time, in both my scholarly, intellectual life and my daily personal life. It's about time, identity, whether we can be the same person after 20 years in a new place with new people, how to deal with those who aren't like us, which maybe is everyone, about home, hiding, rage, grief, imagination, recognition. And I love how it turns the details of everyday life, beds, trees, moving through space, into these richly resonant symbols that define relationships. But of course, loving a poem or loving a text and wanting to keep on rereading it is a very different thing from deciding it's worthwhile to take on the writerly, poetic task, which was going to take me at least 5 years, of creating a new verse translation when there were already over 60 translations into English. So why did I think it was worthwhile to do that? So one reason that I was motivated to do it is to do with poetic form. The Odyssey, as you probably all know, is composed entirely in dactylic hexameter. So a dactyl is a finger, long, short, la, la, la. Andramoi, ennepe, musapo, lutropon, hosmala, polla. So it goes like that with that rhythm all the way through. It's not in free verse, it's not in prose. So the musical, rhythmical effect of it seemed to me essential to the experience. And yet most modern English translations are either in prose or in free verse. They don't actually have any rhythm. So I wanted to produce a totally rhythmical, metrical translation that might invite more reading out loud and more listening to hear that there is a beat there. I also wanted to choose to make my translation exactly the same number of lines as the original, because I think there's a tendency, not just with translations of the Odyssey, but translations in general, to make it longer than the original, in which case you lose the pacing. Of course, if you're translating from a different language, every word doesn't correspond exactly to any other word in your language. If you know this word sort of maps on to 20 different things, then your temptation is always to put down 3 different words to cover your bases. And then you end up with a translation that's half as long again as the original, and it feels much slower. So I wanted to create a translation that wouldn't feel slower than the original. And I did that by forcing myself not to be longer. In general, I wanted to convey something of the clarity, the vividness, the emotional depth, the beauty, and the narrative drive that felt to me essential elements in my own reading of the Greek Homer. I also wanted to try to write as well as I possibly could, on the principle that a great poem should not be turned into a horrible one. An issue for any translator of Homer is what to do about repetition and formulae. The Odyssey is based on a centuries-long oral tradition. During the centuries in which the Greek-speaking world had no reading or writing, nobody was literate for many centuries while these stories were being created, adapted, changed, while they were coming into being. In an oral culture, repetition can be highly valued. That's how you remember things from one generation to another. We know Ring a Ring a Rosie because it's been passed down orally and we repeat it. In our culture, we don't value repetition in the same way. If you read in a written text the same thing being repeated over and over, you think, this writer is lazy. She hasn't bothered to think of a different way to say that. You think it's a cliche, you tend to skip. I wanted to keep some sense of the idea that this is a world where there are stable, repeated elements. There are wine dark seas, and then there are more wine dark seas, and then there are even more wine dark seas. There are dark, quick ships. There's the horse lord Nestor. There's the humble slaves. There's the bread in baskets. There's the bright eyes of Athena. She's always going to have sparkling, bright, glinting eyes. Almost everybody is going to have godlike looks at some point or other. Most people look like gods if they're elite people. But I also wanted to create a language which would feel alive to a literate English reader, which I felt meant reducing the amount of repetition, because I didn't want the repeated components to come across either like cliches or like I'm being Gertrude Stein, Gertrude Stein, Gertrude Stein. So, for instance, the line about rosy-fingered dawn, it appears about 20 times in the Odyssey exactly the same way. In my translation, I keep the same components for each time that line pops up, but I always switch it around. So there's always dawn, she's always a goddess, she's always early or newborn, she always has fingers or touching, she always has roses or flowers or blooming, but I mix up how I do those things to try to make sure the metaphors always feel alive. Because I think if you repeat too much in a literate context, it feels like the metaphors turn dead. The question of verse form and issues about what do you do about linguistic choice are related to larger questions about style. I was aiming for a readable, clear register, avoiding archaisms and foreignisms and high rhetoric and bombast as much as I could. It's not that I'm against bombast. I really liked doing a bombastic style when I did my translations of Seneca, but I didn't feel that that style was actually appropriate for the actually quite clear, simple folk poetry of Homer. I know that some readers have tried to label my translation's style as modernizing or colloquial or even domesticizing, but those labels don't really tell the whole truth, even beyond the fact that most people don't speak iambic pentameter all the time. My language is also fairly artful and artificial. I avoided all contractions like doesn't and didn't, because I wanted it always to sound both, it's not full of the kind of words you have to look up in the dictionary, so it's going to be friendly to the 9th grade reader, but it also doesn't sound entirely like the way I'm speaking right now. Homeric Greek is actually a mix of many different dialects from different parts of the Greek-speaking world, from different eras in archaic Greek history. So it's a weird amalgam of a language which nobody ever actually spoke. I was tempted to try to replicate that linguistic collage quality by using a mix of Cockney, Chaucerian English, Glaswegian, Californian American, Ebonics, text-speak, and so on. It would have been a lot of fun to do, but it would not have been fun for anyone else to read. And it would have meant losing all the other essential qualities of the original, like the easy comprehensibility, the emotional power, the directness, the deep human emotions. So instead of doing that, I just hinted a tiny bit at Homer's linguistic range by using a number of slightly surprising phrases, like canapes, or ossifrage, or scallywag, or indigo for the color of the sea. Translation theorists, like Lawrence Venuti, have argued that translators have an ethical obligation to write in a style they call foreignizing, or that you might call translationese. They argue that foreignizing is the only way to pay due respect to alien cultures, rather than forcing all non-English speakers into this hegemonic Anglophone mode. I think there really is a problematic blindness in North American and British cultures to questions of translation and an unwillingness to read non-Anglophone literature. But I don't think the solution is for all translators to use an off-puttingly foreign style. That seems like the quickest way to ensure that even fewer people read translations. Within classics in particular, badly written translations are often highly valued because they're seen to replicate the experience of the struggling student in intermediate Greek or Latin class. The pain is therefore felt to be authenticating. It's supposed to be unpleasant, like you're chewing through a plate of uncooked kale. But we know that the ancients found Homer really enjoyable. And in fact, Homer in Greek, once you're beyond the intermediate level, is really fun to read, unlike Homer in a lot of English translations. I think we're accustomed to taking for granted what I see as an entirely debatable binary, the idea that translations are either literal or loose. They're either faithful or they're poetic. But that binary relies on the false idea that there's just one thing the original ever says or means. The literal translation, quote-unquote literal, is often totally unfaithful to the form, style, emotional effect of the original. Clunkiness is not the same as truth. The real question for any translator isn't whether to tell the truth or tell a pretty lie. It's a much more complex issue, which truths to tell, of the many possible true facts about the original text, the original language. A central truth that I wanted to tell about the Odyssey was that it is a complex, polyvocal poem. I've seen from teaching it to undergraduates that there's a tendency to assume, I don't mean what I'm going to say, no disrespect to any graphic novel writers, that it's a sort of old-school comic book superhero story, of the non-literary comic book kind, about the unproblematically heroic male Western hero, implicitly white, who is good because he crushes the bad guys, monsters, foreigners, witchy women, understands the value of hospitality, which you write down and get an A on the exam, and the story has a happy ending because good guy gets back with objectified wife and regains all his wealth, all his slaves. So it's a nice celebration of family values, consumerism, patriarchy, war, superiority of normal male white people over foreigners and girls. And I wouldn't like the Odyssey very much if I thought that was all it was ever doing. I wanted to produce a translation that would make it really hard to read the poem like that, which I think it actually is quite hard to read it like that. I think it's surprising that that reading has become so dominant in our culture. I was interested in creating a truthfully complex recreation of what I think is genuinely a complex text. The Odyssey is exploring two central ancient Greek concepts. The first is nostos, the word from which we get nostalgia, the pain of not being at home. Nostos is homecoming. You might think homecoming is a pretty straightforward thing. You just get back to the place where you used to be living. But the Odyssey is exploring a case and a set of cases where homecoming is about as difficult as it could possibly be. In doing that, it shows the profound questions raised by the concepts of being at home, coming home, whether homecoming is essentially exclusive, whether we create a home for ourselves only by keeping other people out or killing them if they try to get in there. The second Greek term is xenia, which means the relationship, but the ideal relationship between strangers, guests, and hosts. Under this code, people have a deep obligation to take care of strangers in need. And in giving and receiving hospitality, families form lasting friendships across great distances of space and across generations. It's in many ways a deeply inspiring ideal, especially in these times of xenophobia and hostility to immigrants. I think that's also one of the big reasons why we should all be reading the Odyssey right now, is that it's about that question. The poem is also showing how exclusive this code can be. In the archaic Greek context, it only applies to elite men, not even elite women, let alone non-elite people. Women aren't supposed to travel. Look at Helen of Troy. That's what happens if you let a woman get out of her country. It shows us also how easily xenia can go wrong, as when the suitors act like bad guests, going into Odysseus' house without being asked, and Odysseus responds by being a not very good host, the kind who kills the guests. The original poem, to me, is compelling precisely because of the nuance and complicatedness of its presentation of its core ideals and values, and because of how deeply it lets us inside the perspectives of so many different characters. I think this diversity of perspectives, which scholarly Homerists have sort of been much more aware of for several decades, thanks partly to feminist readings and narratological readings, is not there in a lot of contemporary translations. One concrete example is that I used the word slave for words which definitely imply slave, but that are commonly rendered with servants or maids or housekeepers, even in translations that have come out after mine in 2018. I've been really surprised, in fact, to see how dominant this trend is. And I think it's part of a systematic blindness that's motivated by the desire to idealize the society of Homer and simplify its ethics by scrubbing out anything that might seem disturbing. We want to like Odysseus, we want to root for him, so he can't be a slave owner. So those are servants, even if the poem doesn't seem to be saying that, in fact. Since publishing my translation, I didn't look at other translations at all during the 5 years I was working on mine, because I didn't want to be put in the position of having to decide, am I going to avoid that because somebody else used it, or so I just looked at the Greek and commentaries, and I didn't look at anything else. But then since publishing mine, over the last year, I've looked at a few passages next to other translations just to try and figure out What did I do differently? What are the trends in how people interpret? Doing that has made me even more aware of what a world of difference in interpretation and characterization, as well as style, can lie in the details of word choice. That adaptation can be a broad brush kind of thing, but it can also come down to the details of choose this word or that word, and it's a completely different scene. I was interested in bringing out the expansive imaginative vision of the Odyssey, whereby we feel for Odysseus himself in all his complexity. We also feel for and understand the people he abandons, mutilates, kills, lets die, the people who don't have a journey home in this poem. In several of the passages I've looked at, other translators seem to shape the narrative so we can look only from one point of view, like that of Odysseus usually. So, for instance, many translations make Calypso, the goddess that he leaves at the start of Book 5, seem like a hysterical nymphomaniac, whereas in my reading of the Greek text, she's dignified, powerful, emotionally intelligent. Her desire and her righteous anger can arouse genuine respect. Or many modern translators make Polyphemus the Cyclops into a, quote, monster or savage, which of course is tapping into modern ideas about colonial othering of native peoples, whereas the Greek text makes him very definitely a human being and allows for at least some degree of sympathy even for the cannibal. Or many translators make the narrator seem entirely to authorize and valorize the deaths of the 12 slave women whom Telemachus, set onto it by his dad, Odysseus, hangs. For instance, some translators have the murderer be called stern or sagacious at the moment when he commits this murder. And they also have the murderer, Telemachus, call the women sluts, even when the Greek text doesn't have any kind of abusive language. And even though Odysseus himself says very clearly that these women were raped. The women's murder, in my view, is motivated within the text by shame and by a desire to restore male honor, not by anything they've actually done. I read the scene as allowing for a heartbreaking empathy for girls who will never have a homecoming, and also for a clear-eyed understanding of what drives a bullied, fragile young man to attack women whose existence makes him feel like less of a man. In the poem, we see Telemachus twice shut up his mother, Penelope, when she tries to speak. We also see how, in the wanderings of Odysseus, there's a preoccupation with the dangers posed by female mouths, the mouths of the sirens, the many mouths of Scylla, the whirlpool Charybdis, who's all mouth. We see how the dopey man-child Telemachus tries to attain manhood by performing the ultimate act of silencing women, which of course involves not stabbing them, which is what Odysseus said he should do, but instead put the rope around their necks, which is a more permanent way to silence. So I'm just going to read my version of that passage. Telemachus then took initiative, insisting, "I refuse to grant these girls a clean death, since they poured down shame on me and mother when they lay beside the suitors." At that, he wound a piece of sailor's rope round the rotunda and round the mighty pillar, stretched up so high no foot could touch the ground. As doves or thrushes spread their wings to fly home to their nests, but someone set a trap. They crashed into a net, a bitter bedtime. Just so the girls, their heads all in a row, were strung up with the noose around their necks to make their death an agony. They gasped, feet twitching for a while, but not for long. So I think the bird simile in that passage works to show that these women, like the birds, are like Odysseus himself. They want a nostos. They want to go home and go to bed. Since that scene is obviously so disturbing, I thought I should end by reading a happier one. So I'm going to read the scene which some readers in antiquity thought should have been the real ending of the poem, when the husband and wife get back together. And I want to just emphasize before I read that I see this passage too as one where there is more than one point of view. They're really carefully distinguished from one another. I've noticed that in both modern scholarly accounts of the scene and in other translations, there's this tendency to subsume Penelope's point of view into that of her husband and to kind of sentimentalize the heteronormative marriage, which is at the center of the poem. It seems to me essential that the Greek makes clear the marriage feels different for her than how it feels to him. As you know, Penelope holds out against acknowledging Odysseus as her husband, even after he's slaughtered all her harassers, all her suitors. Then she shows her canniness, her intelligence, her capacity to play a long game and to wait by testing him. He's a big tester himself, but she tests him by claiming to have moved their bed, the bed he built himself, out of an olive tree that grew through the house. He responds with anger and pain. He's terrified that the supposedly immovable bed might have been moved. He's scared and furious to be reminded the impossible is actually totally possible. His wife might, in the course of 20 years, have slept with someone else. The home or the marriage might not be waiting for him. The whole project of scheming and lying and murdering might be for nothing if its value depends on the unknown quantity of what she thinks. I think we can see, even in this moment of reunion, how they're different. He's constantly using the first person singular about the bed and about the marriage, whereas she's trying to use both the plural and in Greek there's a dual, implying two people together. He knows she could cheat on him. It makes him angry and scared. She has very different kinds of anxieties, kinds of pain and grief, many of which are caused by him. They also have a set of shared stories, shared memories, as well as a shared physical object, the bed. And the passage that I'm going to read ends with a simile, which seems like it should be his experience, but it flips around to become hers. So I think it's also a beautiful moment which shows us, and maybe this is a good way just to start thinking about our literary seminar, about how literature can show you more than one point of view, that it can, through storytelling, you can think you're looking from one perspective, and then you can be looking through somebody else's eyes. This is Penelope speaking, and I do a sort of voice a little bit like the Queen for her, just to emphasize that she's very elite. Now, Eurycleia, make the bed for him outside the room he built himself. Pull out the bedstead and spread quilts and blankets on it. She spoke to test him, and Odysseus was furious and told his loyal wife, "Woman, your words have cut my heart. Who moved my bed? It would be difficult for even a master craftsman, though a god could do it with ease. No man, however young and strong, could pry it out. There is a trick to how this bed was made. I made it, no one else. Inside the court there grew an olive tree with delicate long leaves, full grown and green, as sturdy as a pillar, and I built the room around it. I packed stones together and fixed a roof and fitted doors. At last I trimmed the olive tree and used my bronze to cut the branches off from root to tip and skillfully transformed it to a bedpost. Now, I have told the secret trick, the token. But, woman, wife, I do not know if someone, a man, has cut the olive trunk and moved my bed, or if it is still safe." At that, her heart and body suddenly relaxed. She recognized the tokens he had shown her. She burst out crying and ran straight towards him and threw her arms around him, kissed his face, and said, "Now you have told the story of our bed. You made my stubborn heart believe in you." This made him want to cry. He held his love, his faithful wife, and wept. As welcome as the land to swimmers, when Poseidon wrecks their ship at sea and breaks it with great waves and driving winds. A few escape the sea and reach the shore, their skin all caked with brine. Grateful to be alive, they crawl to land. So glad she was to see her own dear husband, and her white arms would not let go his neck. Okay, I'm going to stop there and hope there's some questions.
Hi. Please stand to ask your question, and we'll come with a mic to you. And we got it somewhere.
You talked about translating from the original several times. Is there more than one original? And if there are a number of originals to choose from, how did you decide which Homeric Greek original to use?
There are standard scholarly editions. I mean, all modern editions are based basically on the same ancient editions which were created in the 2nd and 3rd century BC in Alexandria when Homeric scholarship first got started. So the Homeric text is, there's debate about should this word or that word be in there when we have ancient testimony that maybe there were other ancient readings in antiquity. But it's not, I don't actually think that it's significantly more difficult. It's somewhat less difficult than the text of Catullus, say. So that there's a standard text which, with very minor variations, is what everybody reads in Greek. Yeah. There are different theories about how did our text come into being, what period was it standardized. But I feel like that could get into several hours worth of conversation. So, yeah.
First of all, thank you and congratulations on your wonderful work. Just a couple of two-part question. One is, reading some of the reviews, many of them seem to start with the first translation by a woman. Mm-hmm. I was wondering how you feel about being defined that way. Mm-hmm. Second of all, that part of the question, though, was how do you feel as a woman it helped you to understand this story in a new way?
Mm-hmm. That's great. I'm glad you asked that. So I'm not the first translator of Homer who's a woman. There was a woman who translated the Iliad in 2015, Caroline Alexander, and just also the headlines are part of a Anglophone blindness because there was a French woman, Anne Dacier, who translated it into French prose in 1706. So, in fact, quite a long time later than being the first woman. There are multiple translations by women into French and Italian. There's one into Turkish prose by a woman. There's one into Dutch by a woman, and so on. So I'm not the first woman. I think just point of fact that's important to emphasize. It's also important to emphasize because if you say I'm the first woman, it's as if those women didn't exist, which is not a cool thing to do. I think it's complicated, right? Because men are never asked about their gender. We never say, so Robert Fagles, how did your experience as a man help you understand the male characters? And yet I feel like I'm constantly being asked, your unique feminine perspective must have changed how you read this poem. And I kind of get bored of it. I do think that the fact that I've read some feminism makes a difference. The fact that I'm interested in gender roles makes a difference. The fact I've thought critically about how exactly am I going to portray the gender relationships and how those gender relationships intersect with differences of class and differences of culture, I think that makes a difference. And I'm trying to think critically about social roles. I think it might also make a difference that I don't sort of assume instinctively that women characters are less interesting than male characters. And that insofar as I've experienced marriage, it's been as a wife rather than as a husband. Maybe that makes a difference. But I feel like we need to sort of resist the idea that all women's writing is the same. So there's women's writing, and then there's normal people's writing, and that you can distinguish that in other ways. You know, so that's a little bit problematic, I think. Yeah.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Thank you. I have a question. I think there's debates about the final book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was wondering if you'd address that. Was it sort of written by Homer? Is it an add-on? Sort of the time that you spend with it. Is there something in the language, the original, that seems to indicate is it dramatically different, or if you wanted to weigh in on that debate?
Right. So I mentioned that there were people we know from the Scholia, which are the ancient reports of ancient commentators on the poem. We know from evidence from that there were some commentators in antiquity who said the proper ending of the poem is in the middle of book 23 with the reunion. So even back to antiquity, there were people saying the last book doesn't properly belong. The last book, book 24, is weird in certain ways, partly because it has more distinct settings than the other books. I mean, that we start with Hades, and then we zoom to Ithaca, and then we zoom to the orchard with Laertes, and then we have the final battle with the people of Ithaca. So it's more all over the place. It feels less self-contained. I mean, I think the whole question of what is genuine Homer, given that I don't think Homer is really an author in the same way that, you know, many people here are authors. It's a poem based on a long oral tradition. It may have been composed by a team rather than an individual. I think just in the course of the time I've spent with the poem, which of course is both the previous 3 decades and then the last 5 years of doing the translation, I've come to feel more committed to thinking Book 24 really works as an ending. I think it works insofar as we start off in the first few lines of the poem with Odysseus being defined as the man, as the city sacker. It's one of his epithets. He's the man who sacked a holy city at the start of the journey. And then we end up in Book 24 with, here he is still killing people, that he's back with that element of his identity hasn't gone away. And I kind of like that the poem has both gone through all the other things he can be, and now, by a sort of ring composition, he's back with the warrior self and killing people. So I think it works. I think that the final interaction with Laertes, his old father, where Odysseus still can't give up on tricking and scheming, even when it's completely pointless, that also, I think, is both feels truthful and heartbreaking and wonderful. So I wouldn't want to lose Book 24. Whoever is responsible for it, I'm grateful that we have it. Yeah.
We're reading Odysseus in a group, and we're using Latimer and your translation. And I have to say that every time we interrupt Latimer and read your translation, there's this that goes through the group.
Interesting. Is that a question, or is that just a... Yes. So, I mean, Lattimore, for people who haven't read Richmond Lattimore, late lamented Richmond Lattimore, he uses free verse, very long lines, which sort of look on the page as if they're hexameter, but they're not. And it's somewhat literal. It's sort of literal in style. He doesn't actually repeat wherever the original repeats, because, in fact, he switches up the things he does with each epithet. But it's much more repetitive than mine is, and it's much less... It feels much less like English. So I think the whole question of, do you want a translation that feels more like English or feels less like English? The original feels like Greek, so it doesn't feel like English, either weird English or unweird English. So obviously there's a theoretical set of questions to go with that, and also just an emotional or readerly set of questions. Do you want it to feel, how alien do you want it to feel? Yeah.
I'm curious if, having completed this translation, if it changed you in terms of your thinking, your theoretical thinking about translation as a writer.
I mean, I guess in a way, I had to have my theoretical apparatus to start with. I couldn't have it just right at the end, because that would have been a kind of, to tack on a theory later, you have to have a practice, which has to be informed by a set of thoughts. I think I felt throughout that there are always these impossible choices you make, right? And I also felt, as I was trying to emphasize at the start of my talk, that with a text that's been translated many, many times already, there's a question about what does the English-speaking world need now? Do I need to reinscribe Lattimore when Lattimore already exists? No, that would be a complete waste of time, right? I don't need to do a translation which is exactly the same. It's not that I think my way is the only way to do it, but I also think there wasn't a translation which was like mine out there, so it was worthwhile to do mine. I mean, as I was talking about, partly as a joke, but also not as a joke, about the idea of doing a multi-dialect kind of Homer. I think that would be fun, and I can imagine that, you know, if I was going to be living to 1,000, then I would spend a few years doing that, you know? It's not that I think this is the only way to do it. I mean, I think there are so many different metaphors in how we think about translation, but I think one of the useful metaphors is about, it's like a portrait, right? You can have multiple portraits of a single person, and they can each be truthful in certain ways. You can get a likeness in different ways. There's somebody up top, but maybe there's no...
Emily, you were wonderful.
Thank
when
you.
I was, when I was 14, the Jesuits had me translating from the Greek, and it was fun. The priest jumped up on his desk and sang "Ana Pamusa Palutrapan and Bamala Palakse" to a Sousa march. Da, 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 da.
It's really cool.
It was so much
Yeah.
fun. But then actually appreciating the language or the full story, you know, I'd go home, get a trot, and I'd translate it. And this is not so much a question, but having listened to you and felt it all over again, and I've got a 14-year-old granddaughter, and this is going to be so much fun to take her to this place. And so this is just a thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's very sweet. Thank you.
One last. Much has been made of your choice to translate that all-important word in the first law, polytropos, as complicated rather than many turning or ever cunning. Would you comment on that choice?
Sure.
It's a powerful choice.
Thank you. Thank you. Polytropos, Odysseus is described, unlike many Homeric characters who usually only have one standard epithet, Odysseus is unusual in his multiplicity. He has many epithets, and many of them have to do with manyness. So polou, as in polygamy, it suggests many, and tropos suggests something to do with turning. And I think the fact that this is not actually the most common epithet of Odysseus, it's the one used in the first line of the poem. I think the poem is partly defining itself and the way it tells its story, as well as its protagonist. That it's saying this is a twisty, turny, complicated, layered kind of narrative. That, of course, that's also defining how the story weaves in and out. We don't actually start at the beginning and go through to the end. It's non-linear. It's sneaky in the way that Odysseus himself is sneaky. I wanted to try to come up with a word that would be a real English word, as opposed to doing a subordinate clause, like the man who was turned and was doing a lot of turning, or the much turny, twisty man, again, not real words. So I wanted to define my translation as being as sort of doing the work of going 100% into English. And then it's quite difficult to come up with a word in English which suggests something to do with turniness and twistiness, which could apply to a journey, a poem, a person, that would have something like that metaphor in there, and that would be a sort of, ideally a fairly long word, because I wanted there to be a sense that you're going to notice this word, as I think you notice polytropon. So I sort of went through what are the different possibilities, and within English, there are not that many possibilities. Once you've decided, I don't want to do something which isn't a real word, or I also don't want to do something which isn't what it means. So, for instance, there were quite a lot of translations which translated as if it meant something like wily, because we assume Odysseus is wily, but it doesn't mean that. If you use English words which definitely suggest having been turnedness in a metaphorical way, then you can get into the wrong connotation. Like, I didn't want to say a perverted man or a kinky man. That was the wrong connotation. So I felt that complicated was, in a way, like all words, like 100% of the word choices, it was kind of a compromise, because it suggests something about folds and layeredness. I think it suggests the interior complicatedness, maybe a little bit more than the complicatedness of the journey, but I hope that sort of emerges as you keep reading. It's hard to get everything into a single word. That's why ideally you want more than one word. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question, maybe two.
Okay. I'd like to ask a question regarding the Audible version of your book. I've been reading your book in hard copy and listening to Claire Danes, who's the narrator. And I think Claire Danes is a brilliant choice, by the way, and most people in this room know Claire Danes quite well. But I was curious, what discretion does an author like you have in determining with Audible who the reader is, or whether you'll read it? And also, did you consider multiple readers, such as Lincoln and the Bardo, for instance, where different people would read different characters?
I had no power whatsoever. I mean, I'm really happy that they chose a woman, because there's so few classic Greco-Roman classics that do have women readers on Audible. And of course, we don't know who was Homer. I feel like maybe Homer's preferred pronoun should be they rather than he or she. So I didn't get to choose. I mean, it would be wonderful if one day there would be an audio version with multiple voices, because of course one of the main things I was trying to emphasize today was that I think this is genuinely a sort of proto-dramatic deeply multivocal kind of poem, and it would be great to have a recording that would bring out more of that. There have been several both marathon readings of people reading the whole thing, doing different performance things with it. I've been to some of them, but not all of them. They've been all around the world. I've also done a play version, which of course has different people speaking the different parts. So I wanted that to activate the dramatic and multivocal qualities of the original. But yeah, I had Audible is a big company, and they did not listen to me at all. I had no voice there. Yes, but I'm happy with Claire Danes. It's great. Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all.